last minute. So thank you for coming. This is through our church and society work area, which is part of the broader United Methodist Church, which looks at how we operate as a church and society, especially in regards to social and political issues. So Mollie is here to help us learn a little bit about what is on the ballot on Tuesday. And we are so glad that she is here.
Thank you so much for having me and my organization here. It's been nice to spend the morning with you all. I was downstairs for a little bit, hear the choir and the organ. So I really appreciate you all spending some time after church with us to learn about the state questions. My name is Mollie Tindle. I'm the Northeast Regional Organizer for Oklahoma Policy Institute. I develop relationships within communities across Northeastern Oklahoma and help people learn advocacy skills and learn about what's on the ballot so that they can hold our governments accountable. We're mostly focused on state level policy. That'd be better.
Let's turn your mic on.
Okay.
Maybe. Okay, well, we're going on mic.
Maybe not. Okay. I will work hard to project. If you can't hear me, please let me know. Tend to drop a little bit and get too quiet sometimes. So I'm not afraid if you tell me you can't hear me. Okay. Oklahoma Policy Institute is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. We do data-driven research and advocacy work, focused mostly at the state level, so that you will have some city council races in Tulsa coming up this week. There'll be some runoffs for federal elections. Our organization's mostly focused at the state level, which is why we focus on these state questions. A lot of our work also involves cultivating excellent relationships with legislators from across the political spectrum, because we do a lot of work with coalitions and we do a lot of work with compromise, again, with a data-driven lens. So we're going to talk about the state questions that are going to be on the ballot on Tuesday, unless you voted early already. There are 2 state questions on this ballot for this week. There will be another 2 state questions in November. I'm only going to talk about the 2 that are going to be on Tuesday because all 4 of them are incredibly dense and it takes about 25 minutes to get through just 2 state questions. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers as well. And if I don't know the answer to something, please take my card. I can get you in contact with a person who will. Our policy analysts have worked really hard to develop this presentation, and they also work really hard to be able to answer questions that I can't answer. So we're going to start with state question 844. This is the ad valorem reimbursement fund methodology change, which is a mouthful. Ad valorem is the Latin word for property tax. So anytime you see ad valorem in this presentation, just think property tax. So a little bit of background on what this state question is doing. There's 2 components to the state question. Well, there's 1 component to the state question, but there's 2 parts in the history of why the state question exists that are important. The first part is a tax exemption. This started after the economic issues in the late 70s and early 80s. Unemployment was really high in Oklahoma, bank failures, gas lines, all those things. And so Oklahoma lawmakers wanted to kind of jumpstart the economy, and they thought that a 5-year manufacturing property tax exemption would be one of the ways to kind of get some new investment into the state of Oklahoma. So in 1985, they introduced a state question to create this exemption called the 5-year manufacturing ad valorem exemption. And because that was introduced via state question, amendments to this process are also done via state question. Importantly, both this state question and the next one are not coming as citizen ballot initiatives. I'm sure you heard about the minimum wage state question back in the June primary. That was a citizen ballot initiative, which means they went and they collected signatures to get it put onto the ballot. These 2 state questions were passed by the legislature this last spring and then put onto the ballot, which means they're coming from legislative leadership. They're not coming from the people of Oklahoma. So that's a little bit of background. And this is how it works. And this is the really complicated part. So I want to make sure that this is understood before we move on to the next step. So if anyone has questions after I'm done explaining this first bit, please let me know. The way that this works is that a company will come in. They're going to be new to the state or new to this area, and they would normally pay, as you can see, they would pay property taxes. Property taxes are one of the only taxes that stays local. It stays in your county. It pays for roads, emergency services, sheriff's offices, fire departments, and most importantly, public schools and career tax. It's very important because that funding stays local. So if a company comes in, normally they would pay property taxes and those would stay at our local level. However, with the exemption, for the first 5 years of their existence, they won't pay those property taxes, which means if they use this exemption, which means emergency services, schools, fire, sheriff's offices won't get that money. It's a bit of a problem because municipalities and counties have very few ways that they are legally allowed to raise revenue. That's why they're reliant on property taxes and on sales taxes. And so the state legislature, when they created this state question to create this exemption, they also created a reimbursement fund, which means that some money from the state funding, which is allowed to be income taxes, capital gains taxes, corporate taxes, that's state revenue. And the state revenue fund would reimburse the counties for the lost property taxes. So if the company is not paying for it, that's why there's an X there, the state is going to come in and reimburse the county for what they would lose. I like to use $5 as an example because everyone understands $5. So if the company was paying $5, well, that's what they should be paying, but because of the exemption, they're paying $0, the state's going to reimburse the county that $5 that they would lose for the first 5 years. After that, the company then has to pay property taxes every year. And that's why there's two components in understanding like the background before we can even get into what the state question does, because there's the manufacturing exemption and there's the reimbursement fund. This state question does not do anything with the exemption. If you agree with it, great. If you don't agree with the exemption, the state question doesn't have anything to do with that existing or not. The state question only has to do with the reimbursement fund. And this is where it gets a little funky. The reimbursement fund is funded by 1% of income tax that's generated by the state. So when you pay your income tax, 1% of that goes into this reimbursement fund. So ultimately, while state revenue is covering the lost property taxes, it's really the people of Oklahoma that are subsidizing these companies because that's our income tax going back to the counties to cover what these companies are not paying. So in the last 40 years, and there's a lot of timelines up here, but in the last 40 years, the taxpayers of Oklahoma, all of us, have subsidized almost $3 billion for these corporations. That also means our local governments would have lost out on $3 billion if this reimbursement fund didn't exist, which that's a lot of money for schools. And yes, it's split over 40 years, but $1 billion is so much money. So it's important to know that this reimbursement fund has been widely used in the last 40 years as well. So what this state question would do if it passes, if you vote yes and it passes, this state question will give the legislature full authority to change how this reimbursement fund works. Unfortunately, it doesn't specify any restrictions on the legislature for coming up with a reimbursement method change. So there's no checks and balances. It doesn't say you can change the fund, but only by so much. It doesn't say you can change the fund, but you can't change the counties. Instead, there's no details or guidelines on how this fund could change. The legislature could even completely eliminate the reimbursement fund. or minimize payments and say, well, you're only going to get 50% back or 25% back. And what that would do is really hurt local governments who rely on property taxes to pay, again, emergency services, roads, schools, sheriff's offices, the parts of government that we most interact with on a daily basis and that our neighbors most interact with, especially our neighbors in rural Oklahoma, who already have a hard time getting ambulances to be able to take them to hospitals because of the rural hospital closures. So I just say that to kind of make a bigger picture too of outside Tulsa and the way that this is. So one of our concerns as an organization is what's wrong with the current reimbursement system. As it stands now, the Oklahoma Tax Commission is who oversees this reimbursement. So they will get an exemption reimbursement request from a local government, like Tulsa County. Tulsa County will send up their reimbursement request to the Oklahoma Tax Commission. The Oklahoma Tax Commission will verify that it's accurate and then send money to the county, and the county treasurer, who you all vote for, make sure that that gets dispersed to where it needs to go. Because the Oklahoma Tax Commission oversees this process, it creates a little bit of neutrality as well, because that's not an elected body. The legislature is an elected body. It's also a very partisan body, whereas the Oklahoma Tax Commission is not. So another concern is that because this state question gives broad powers to the legislature, they could make this a much more politicized process. And unfortunately, I feel like I'm talking a lot in coulds and shoulds and maybes and mights, but that's actually what the state question opens us up to, is we're just handing off power to the legislature and we don't have any more say over what happens next. Surprisingly, there is a lot of opposition to this state question coming from all across the political spectrum in Oklahoma. Also, a lot of state superintendents, educators, and local governments, representatives of local governments are opposed to this as well, because it takes away local tax dollars and they don't really have good ways of making up lost revenue, except for more sales taxes. Because if the legislature chose to eliminate the reimbursement fund, to cut the reimbursement fund, or to cut certain counties out of it, it could have a really negative impact on local government and local services. Mays County is a couple counties over from us here in Tulsa County. They use about 40% of this fund every year. And they do that because there's a lot of manufacturing coming into that area. And there is some concern that the legislature would try to cut Mays County out of using this reimbursement fund if they can pick and choose and play favorites with counties, simply so that the fund could go further, or that other counties maybe could use more of the exemptions. The problem with that is that if they cut Mays County out or didn't allow Mays County to get their full reimbursement, Mays County could lose a lot of services because they would not be able to make up that property tax loss. Because the exemption is still going to exist regardless of what happens. All this state question is doing is addressing the reimbursement fund. Any questions so far? Yes, ma'am.
So is the whole thing to attract manufacturing business into Oklahoma?
That's why it was started back in the 1980s. Yes. And that's been a mixed bag depending on who you talk to. Some companies will come in and take advantage of the exemption along with other tax loopholes, and they'll set up shop for about 5 years. And once the exemption ends, they'll leave. There's a lot of empty buildings going out towards Wagner, going out towards Tahlequah, where there's a lot of land and a lot of manufacturing and companies out there. We've seen some places or some companies use the exemption for 5 years and then abandon everything, which means they take the jobs with them, they take their money with them. They're not going to be paying any property taxes. And it can leave a lot of blight as well, rural blight. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been any conversation about eliminating that 5-year plan?
So that would be, I've seen conversations spark from this state question where people go, oh, well, maybe this isn't such a great idea. In order to get rid of the exemption itself, I believe that would probably take a citizen initiative where you go and you collect the signatures and then you get it removed.
At least the study should be done to
Yes.
see what benefit it has for Oklahoma.
An interim study would be really useful, especially now that we're seeing conversations around data centers, data storage centers, and smelters, especially up here in northeastern Oklahoma. I think more and more people are starting to become a little bit more cautious when it comes to these exemptions. Other states like Louisiana have seen a lot of companies get started and then pull out if it becomes too costly, and then they leave the state on the hook, or counties or the people of the state on the hook for cleanup, for turning those sites into something usable. It becomes very expensive for the people of the state. Yes, ma'am.
Are these questions by design worded to confuse all of us? So we don't know what in the hell we're voting on?
As a rule, I think so. It's also hard because we're supposed to be able to see the language of what the new law or the new rule would be. So you do need to actually read and see the legalese of the way that the lawyers wrote up what the legislature wanted. However, it's not well explained, and our state does not do a good job of getting the word out there, A, that there's an election, or B, what the state questions actually mean. So yes, I think that functionally it's intended to confuse people. Yes.
One of the reasons this got started was that other states were doing this, and so we were losing out on some industry. That's how it got started.
The manufacturing.
It's still, and
Manufacturing.
it's still that way. Other states are offering this. So if we want a chance at some industries, there in prior, Google is a fantastic industry that came in there. And so we're lucky to have gotten it there.
How long have they been there? Do you know?
A while.
A while? 10 years.
Quite a long time.
They've been there for a while.
And they keep adding to it, and so they keep getting, I assume,
Okay.
some of this.
Yeah, and there's other exemptions, there's other tax breaks and loopholes beyond just this one. But that's why I clarified the difference between the exemption and the reimbursement fund, because we're only voting on a reimbursement fund change. We're not touching the exemption itself with this state question.
So can you tell us? So if you vote, is it a yes and no? I haven't seen the ballot.
Yes or no?
Yes and no, okay.
So a yes vote would give the legislature the power to change the reimbursement fund,
Okay,
which is open-ended. It doesn't have any details on what that could mean. So they could play favorites with counties. They could make the process more partisan or political. They could cut the exemption in part, or they could cut it off, or I'm sorry, the fund, the reimbursement fund, they could cut that off completely, or they could reduce it in some way. It leads to a big question mark, and it leads to the legislature having a lot of new power and the people really not getting a say in what that looks like. A no vote keeps things exactly as they are right now. The exemption exists, the reimbursement fund exists. Some supporters say that there's not enough money in the reimbursement fund. If that's the case, more targeted legislation could increase the reimbursement fund and adjust that problem. But that's not what this state question does. And because it just hands basically a blank check over to the legislature, a lot of organizations, people, and local governments are worried. Yes, sir.
I wish I could remember who said this, but I'm not getting any better with names as I get older. But I did hear one legislature accuse the local assessors of inflating their assessments in order to get more money from the reimbursement fund, which I find a little scary.
Our legislature, as a rule, and I'm not saying anything about, I'm not getting into weeds here, but as a rule, the state legislature doesn't always get along super, super well with other levels of government because everyone is kind of in competition for revenue. And then if the state is like, well, we're struggling with revenue, so we don't want to reimburse counties, but counties are like, hey, we only have so many ways of raising revenue. And if we don't have revenue, we're going to have to cut services to people. That's where that conversation that's where that tension comes from. Yes, ma'am.
And maybe you've already addressed it and I missed it, but the very last bullet point, what's wrong with the current system? And who wants this? Who brought the property tax reimbursement? Who brought the question to the forefront?
The state legislative leadership. So Speaker of the House Kyle Hilbert of Bristow and Senator Pro Tem Lonnie Paxton. Their leadership and then that group of lawmakers is who has brought this. They shepherded it through the spring session of the legislature, got that passed, and that's why it's going to be on our ballots.
And what's wrong with the current system?
Supporters of this state question say that there might not be enough funds in there, or they just want to reshape it in some way. Opponents say that this could give the legislature incredibly broad powers to change things, and they've not told us exactly what they plan to do with that, which could open it up to being perhaps unfair in that balance between state and local government.
So there's no transparency with what the legislature is motivated.
Correct. We can surmise based on information. We can gather information, which our organization has done. But it's not like they're coming out and just saying, hey, we want to do this because, yes.
So each county would have the opportunity to lobby for their own benefit.
Yeah. And there's like the Oklahoma Municipal League. There are local government affinity or association groups that will come out and kind of work together to be like, hey, this is a bad idea, or hey, this is a good idea to the legislature, and remind them that they're not the only government in the state of Oklahoma. And also the state legislature, it's been complicated. Even folks in the same party last year, they were fighting a lot. That's the other thing that makes this unclear, because there's a lot of factions right now in our legislature. And even though that legislative makeup might change because of the November election, because at least for the House, every 2 years, they're having to run again. There's just a lot of open-ended details that we don't know, but we're being asked to basically just hand them that authority and trust them. Yes, sir.
Pretty much the legislature doesn't pass laws to spend more money. So this would be a way for them to save money.
Correct. But the question is, does that come at the expense of counties and cities and citizens if the parts of government we most touch are the things that are the services provided by these property taxes and then reimbursed from the state revenue fund?
So in other words, like Tulsa might not have an issue with funding their departments, but someplace like Timbuktu.
Right, like Mays County's a great example. If the legislature said, we'll only reimburse half, if they said, we're gonna cut the reimbursements to only 50% of the exemption, that would leave that county kind of scrambling for funds. And counties and cities can only raise revenue through sales taxes and property taxes. It's pretty limited.
So the reason that it leaves them scrambling for funds is these industries bring in new population that has to be supported. New school enrollment, new fire and police obligations for new housing that goes in. At the Mid-America complex, there are 4,500 employees. There, probably 60% of which came in from outside, built houses and added to the local costs.
Okay. And there's also some issues. I mean, part of the larger picture too is some of these counties where there's manufacturing companies, those are the big employers. And then if they leave, which we've seen in some of these cases, they're also leaving people, leaving places with fewer jobs, which can be a really big struggle, especially in rural spaces. Yeah. All right, I'm going to move on to state question 846. If you have any more questions, I will try and answer more towards the end, but I want to make sure we get through 846 first. This is a proposed change to the voter ID requirements in Oklahoma for voting. So a little bit of backstory on the voter ID requirements that we have now is that in 2010, by a vote of the people through a legislative driven state question. So again, not a ballot initiative, but something that was from legislative leadership. The people of Oklahoma voted to pass voter ID requirements, which means that when we go vote, we have to verify who we are at the polls. And we do that with, and I'll get into this in a second, like what the current requirements are. The ACLU of Oklahoma worked really hard to ensure that there was one method of proving your identity that was free. The United States has a big history of voter discrimination and disenfranchisement, and a lot of people consider IDs that you have to pay for to be a functional poll tax. Poll taxes used to exist in order to ensure that Black folks and other minority groups would not be able to vote because they would have to pay to vote. Those are illegal now, but a lot of groups think that requirement of an ID that you have to pay for is a functional poll tax. And so in 2010, they made it possible to use your voter registration card that you get issued to you, which is free. So there is a method within all of this that is also free. And that'll make sense in just a second. So Oklahoma already requires ID to vote. For 16 years, we've submitted our IDs, we've signed for our ballots. A lot of you, Ms. Sharon, you work at the polls on election day. You know this process very well. What State Question 846 would do is in two parts. The first thing it would do is add the existing requirements to the state constitution. Currently, the existing requirements are only in state law, and there's a big difference. Something in state law can be modified and changed. It can also be taken to court much easier. Something in the state constitution, it's harder to change, and it's harder to take to the court system if it's too restrictive. The other thing that this does is expands legislative authority to define voter ID requirements. They don't have to change them from what they are now, but this allows them the possibility of changing them. This is the current voter ID law situation that is in state statute, which is state law. There's in-person voting and then there's mail-in voting. And if you're doing in-person voting, there's different ways that you can present your ID. You can present a valid photo ID or your voter registration card to the poll worker. And then, you have the three and you see the first one and you show who you are and you sign. And then the second person gives you your ballot. You know how that goes. If you don't have your ID on you, say you didn't put your wallet in the purse when you switched it over, you can vote by provisional ballot, which means it's a special separate ballot that doesn't get tallied in the machine. It is held onto, and then the county election board will verify your identity on the back end. Because you're registered through the election board, so they have ways to check. The other thing that you can do if you request an absentee ballot is you can have that notarized. Notaries are agents of the state. So in this case, they count as an election official. And you get your ID, or you present the notary your ID, get your ballot notarized. And then if you hand deliver that, you also show your ID to the county election board when you hand them your ballot, your sealed ballot. If you do mail-in voting, you can request your absentee ballot by providing identifying information. You can do that through the Oklahoma voter portal. It's really easy. You just click some buttons and request your absentee ballot. If you are mailing it in and you are not homebound or have a physical disability that keeps you at home, you can have it notarized and then you can just drop it in the mail. It's really easy to do. I voted this way before. You just have to get your envelopes right when you're sending in your ballot. If you are unable to leave home, the requirement for a notary changes to only 2 witnesses. It's a lower threshold of proving your identity just because it's much harder for folks who are homebound to get out and find a notary. And this assumes that someone could come to them, which is really important for keeping voting accessible for all of Oklahoma. and including Oklahomans with physical disabilities or who are homebound. The way it stands now, a valid ID is government issued and has your name. That's what has to match. A picture of you, unless it's your free voter registration card, and an expiration date that either is after the election or an ID that doesn't expire. So tribal cards, medical marijuana cards, gun licenses, these are all issued by governments. Those you can use actually to vote, as well as your driver's license, your non-driving ID, your passport. There's lots of methods of showing who you are. And most importantly, that free voter registration card. That also says who you are. The legislature already prevents fraud, and they already have power from the Constitution to prevent fraud. They are allowed to enact such laws as may be necessary to detect and punish fraud in elections. These laws exist in state statute, which means they can be updated as needed. And then Oklahoma already has some of the most secure and accurate elections. Even the very conservative far-right group, the Heritage Foundation, ranks Oklahoma as number 7 in secure elections. If we zoom out a little bit and go to the national picture, American elections are really hard to mess with like the mechanisms of voting, because every state runs their own elections. Within the state, every county, and then within the county, every precinct has their own processes. So there's not really a good way, especially in the state of Oklahoma, to go in and tamper with things. Which begs the question, why are we being asked to vote on the state question? If we have very secure elections, even a far-right group says that we do, why is the legislature asking us to vote on this? Well, part of the reason they would like us to vote on this is because this expands legislative authority. This would add a new section and take those voter ID laws and put them into the state constitution, which makes them much harder to change. Some of the things that the legislature would get to define are highlighted here in red, including who an appropriate election official is, how this would be required for any method of voting, and then specifying requirements for proof of ID. So if State Question 846 passes, if enough voters vote yes, voter ID requirements will not automatically change. The legislature still has to meet and decide on the new rules as a body. Now, they could go into special session, but based on the tensions from the spring, unlikely that they would get their act together to do that in the fall. So more than likely, we would see changes in the spring of the next legislative session. State Question 846 will require the legislature to define ID requirements, such as what counts as voter ID, who counts as an appropriate election official, and how and when people must present voter ID for each method of voting. Also, by putting it in the Constitution, it makes it harder to challenge any changes through the court system if these are really restrictive requirements that the legislature makes. There's a national conversation right now about making voting harder to do. Some states, like the state of Washington, have tried to make voting more accessible and efficient for people. They will send you your ballot. You have 30 days to complete it. They will send you information about what you will be voting on, and that is sent to you by the state. Like your tax dollars go into making sure that you can make an informed decision. The state of Oklahoma does not do any of that, and unfortunately has a history of trying to do some pretty restrictive voter ID laws. So some of the concerns about State Question 846 include we're worried that it could significantly restrict voting access, especially because we are handing power again to the legislature to decide for themselves what's going to happen without any input or guidance from the people. It's basically, again, just handing them a blank check and being like, hey, you can fill this in how you want. Some of the concerns are that because it's so broad, the legislature might try to pass something that's more restrictive. What that means is they might rule out certain kinds of ID. They might eliminate the free registration card that you can use. They might narrow how and when voters could cast a provisional ballot. The important thing about the provisional ballot is it exists when you don't have an ID. So if that goes away and you leave your ID at home or you don't have it for some reason, the question is, if this passes, would you be able to cast a provisional ballot, which could limit some people at the polling place? There's another really big concern. I don't know if you've all heard of the Federal SAVE Act, but it is a federal attempt to make elections more national and federalized and take away some state power. The other component of it is it would require proof of citizenship to vote, not just proof of identity. As it stands now with Oklahoma laws and with most laws in most other states, when we bring our card or IDs or passports, we're just saying, yes, this is me. But if we have to prove our citizenship to a poll worker every single time, that requires other kinds of documents, some of which are hard for people to access, especially if they're in situations different than ours. I happen to have my birth certificate. But the Federal SAVE Act has some specifications where if your names don't match, you might not be able to vote, or you'd have to do a bunch of extra steps to prove who you are, not just as a person, but as a citizen. Like my birth certificate has my maiden name on it, not my married name. One of the issues with the Federal SAVE Act is it could disenfranchise a lot of women because our names wouldn't match. If we've never gone back to our maiden names, or if our birth certificates have our maiden names, maybe you lost your marriage license, maybe it's hard to access vital documents because it's just so open-ended and we don't know where the legislature, like what the legislature would do, but they do have really broad powers. There is a concern that they could try and make this an issue of citizenship, not just identity, like the Federal SAVE Act does. The other concern is that this state question, just by, again, virtue of being so broad and not specific and not having checks and balances in it, could make voting by mail more confusing and less accessible to people, which could disenfranchise voters who rely on voting by mail. Again, that's a lot of physically disabled folks, homebound folks. If they lose ways of voting that are accessible and simple for them, we could have a bunch of disabled and elderly folks basically disenfranchised and not able to vote, which is not fair to people. But just because they have a physical disability and can't leave the home to get their ballot notarized, that they wouldn't be able to vote. There is also a concern that lawmakers would do away with no excuse mail-in voting entirely. With our laws right now, you can just request an absentee ballot for no reason and then fill it out and send it through the mail. That's really helpful if you travel often or if you travel for long periods of time. Because again, in most election years, we have several elections. So it's not like you're just getting this for November and you can plan around it. If you have an election in June and August and November, but you're traveling during the summer, you might miss one of those. So it's actually really important for you to have access to mail-in voting so that you can not have to plan everything around election days. The other thing that helps is people who work the polls. They either have to vote early or vote absentee because most of the time they are not working in their own precinct. And we are very grateful for people who work the polls on election day. It's I was just talking to Sharon about it. It's a 14-hour day. It is really, really tough work. And if we make it harder for the people that provide that public service to vote, fewer people will become poll workers, and we already don't have enough as it is. So that's another big concern. Finally, State Question 846 makes it harder to challenge any of this in court. By putting it in the Constitution, if they pass something restrictive, which again is an if, because this is so broad, it would be much, much harder for the people of Oklahoma to challenge this in court. If they pass something that a lot of people go, hey, this is too restrictive. This is no longer about providing safe elections. This is about making sure that certain people can't vote. And we want to take that through the court system because this state question takes all of this law, existing and new, and puts it into the Constitution. It's much, much harder to challenge through the court system. Supporters of the state question are going to talk about how we need to make voting harder. We need to make it more of a privilege and less of a right. We need to make sure it's extra, extra, extra safe. But again, our elections are already safe. Our elections in Oklahoma are very safe and secure. We already prove our identity when we vote. So as folks who have more concerns with this state question, we're also coming at this with, we're very worried that these broad powers might be used against the people of Oklahoma. That's the presentation. Anybody have questions about this one? And then we can always go back to 44 if we need to. Yes, ma'am.
On both of these questions, it looks to me like the legislature has brought the proposal. And if the proposals pass, the legislature gets more power.
Yes, it is. And neither of them have guidance on or restrictions on that power. There's no checks and balances.
What does it take for the legislation to put a question on the ballot?
They have to pass it through both chambers,
Okay.
like a regular bill. So it would go through committees and then it would go through, depending on who sponsored it, either the House or the Senate. And then if it passes, it gets sent to the other chamber. And if the identical copies, and they have to talk, they have to also send it through committee. Sometimes there's changes. And then by the time it gets passed identically through both chambers, that's when it can go on the ballot.
So both Republicans and Democrats and independents or whatever have said they want this question on the ballot.
Ooh, 100%.
Oh,
In this case, and we could go, anybody can go look and see who voted for or against putting this
oh, it's just a majority.
through. It's the majority.
Okay.
Every legislator in that elected body gets a chance to vote. But I think that you will see that, in fact, I know that you will see both of these would have fallen across party lines. This is a vote that would fall along party lines. And also a lot of the more moderate Republicans do not support these pieces of legislation. Okay, yes.
It's the bottom line that we elect our legislature and it's a matter of trusting them. And so, when they put something like this in front of us, then we're not trusting that they know what they're doing.
I think it's accurate to say that your vote could reflect your trust in the legislature. If you have high trust in the legislature, you might want to vote yes. If you have low trust or moderate trust, you might want to vote no. Sir?
I just had one comment. My state legislator, Sue Tibbs, rest her soul, was involved in the debate to require an ID.
Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of stuck over this question of money, charging people to vote. And she was the one that came up with a compromise to allow people to use their voter registration card, which is free, in order to vote. And in that, then it passed the legislature and got onto the ballot in the first place. And that is always a big thing if you have to pay to vote, and even amongst the Republicans, a lot of Republicans. So this is interesting to me that they didn't feel like that was enough or whatever. They feel like they have to change it. I think it's also, as you're asking these questions, to note that they have made it much more difficult for citizen petitions to get through.
Yes.
They've increased the number of signatures you have to gather. They've reduced the amount of time you have to gather them. And the last thing that came through, which I think I'm still a little iffy about, is they used AI to verify signatures. And and one last little bit of information, Utah did a voter audit. They audited every registered voter in the state. After they have access to things that allow them to determine citizenship, for instance, that the public does not have access to. And there's several million people voting in Utah, over a million for sure. I don't know. Once again, I'm not very good with numbers. And around 10,000 they couldn't verify. And so they went through and hand verified, pretty quickly verified about 5,000 of them. So that left that one with 5,000. Out of those, there were only 25 at the time they published the report that were illegally registered to vote.
And the penalties for that are very
only
high.
13 had ever voted. So and there are plenty of immigrants and citizens, people in Utah that are not citizens that potentially could vote illegally if there was going to be a fraud. So I think that's just the first.
So is it a power grab?
Hmm?
Is it a power grab by the legislature?
It's what she says. It's voter,
Restrictions.
I'm not speaking for OPI. It appears that they want to keep certain groups, people from voting. And we know from watching voter returns come in that the mail-in ballots that are counted later do not always match the ballots that are come in originally in the count. So sometimes polls will close and one person wins, but then they count the mail-in ballot, somebody else. So it's like you pretty much know who you're keeping for voting.
There's a national trend right now of making voting harder to access. Somewhere between 5 and 7 states have already passed restrictive voter IDs that look very similar to the federal SAVE Act, which makes it much, much harder for people to vote, especially, unfortunately, women. There's also a lot of national chatter that started on the fringes and is becoming more mainstream about trying to get women to not vote. So there's, also Sue Tibbs was my rep when I was a kid. I paged for her in high school. Yeah. She was fantastic.
I have a question.
Oh, Sharon, real quick, there's a lady behind you. Oh, I'm so sorry.
Go ahead.
Is it a coincidence that these are on the ballot when it's traditionally the smallest out?
They do that all the time.
It is not a coincidence. In fact, there was a lot of debate in the legislature on whether these state questions would be added. It was too late for June because that ballot was already finalized. There was a lot of conversation about whether they would all go on November, all go on August, or be split. And in the end, we've seen them split, which just from our organization's perspective makes it a little easier because we can just talk about 2 at a time.
Right.
Because all 4 are very dense this year. Sometimes state questions are much lighter. They're not as intense, but these are pretty intense ones.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
When you go to register to vote in Oklahoma, just talking, even just Tulsa County, because that's where I work.
Mhm.
To get your voter registration card, do you have to prove your citizenship? I would think, right?
You put your driver's license number,
But I mean,
ID
you don't have a
number.
driver's license. If you're a poor person.
You put your social security number
And you only get a social security number.
if you're a citizen. Mhm.
Okay.
Also, our county election boards, they are able to access federal government databases that prove citizenship. That's why they can verify and check things on the back
So it's
end.
still a law. You need to be a citizen before you can vote.
Right.
Right.
Or in the state of Oklahoma, if you have a felony, you have to basically serve all your time, do all your probation, and after that's completed, then you can re-register to vote.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Anything else? Yes, sir.
I'm an example of how hard it can be on people to prove their identity. When I applied for a visa, it turned out I discovered my parents never turned in a birth certificate. And it took 2 full days in Oklahoma City to finally get that taken care of. If I had been a working bloke that couldn't get away at a lower level scale, it would have just been impossible. I'd have probably just given up.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful illustration. Yeah, you had the ability to go and fight and say, hey, I'm right here. I was born. I can prove this. Just because my parents messed up doesn't mean I should lose access to voting. But you're right. If you are a mom with kids, if you're working and you can't get off, if you're paycheck to paycheck, if you're unhoused, there's so many ways that you would not be able to spend 2 days or even get to Oklahoma City to fight that. So thank you for sharing. That's really helpful.
So if you were adopted in your birth certificate and you took the name of the family, that adopted you, it could be challenging to.
Under the Federal SAVE Act, yes. And if the state legislature follows that direction, which we've seen other states do, those kinds of discrepancies could make it harder to vote. The other thing is, a lot of people don't think about their registration or proving their identity until the day of the election. And so if you're like, okay, I've got my plan to vote, I'm gonna go after 5, after I get off work, and you get there and they've changed it and what you have is no longer good, you might not be able to vote that day. So you might be able to vote again in the future if you figure it out. But we're seeing that a lot of these restrictive laws are really more about disenfranchising people. And while some of that can be targeted, especially like we're talking about like with maiden names versus married names through the Federal SAVE Act, it kind of is a patchwork landscape across the rest of the states. And again, we talk about could or might or if, because this is handing very broad powers to the legislature. We can say these are things that we've seen in other states. We can say this are things we can hear nationally through the conversations going on, but we can't also predict exactly how this could look. So it could look way more, if it passes, maybe this is way more benign than we think. But based on national trends, based on other states, does not seem benign. Yes, sir.
Another comment here is that once something goes in the Constitution, it's almost impossible to remove it. So these questions would put this in the Constitution. I would prefer myself to have things so that they can be changed.
Agreed. In fact, when State Question 802 passed in 2020, that one was Medicaid expansion. And that one was written intentionally to put it into the Constitution because the folks organizing that campaign were worried that the legislature would roll back Medicaid expansion because they kept saying that they would, and they've been rejecting it, even though the people of Oklahoma wanted it. Very clearly, it was polling with it polled with some popularity, especially in the metro areas. So we see there kind of a reverse of this one, where in order to protect policy that made healthcare more accessible for the people of Oklahoma, they put it in the Constitution to make sure that the legislature couldn't mess with it. In this case, if the legislature is asking us to put these broad powers into the Constitution, it's kind of the opposite. Then it's they're getting to decide, and then it goes in the Constitution, and we don't have a say other than like calling and writing letters. So that's a very good point. Any other questions?
I have just a public service announcement. Being a judge at the poll, look at your ID and make sure it's not expired. If it is, if you have a passport or find your voter card, it never expires. That's all you need. I personally make a point of voting with my voter registration card because it's free. Yes.
And because I personally, this is not my organization, I personally do think that ID requirements are a functional poll tax. I'm a historian. My knowledge of American history tells me those things. But everyone is able to do what they want.
And another nice thing, the voter ID card tells you what party you're in. It makes it easier for me to look your name up. And people, I have a great precinct, and people, seriously, don't be afraid to vote. I have people that don't want to go to the voting places. I said, I am so sorry because we have a great, and everybody I talk to that works, there's never anything. Very, very few. But some people get, why do you have to ask me my party? I said, well, it's because I have 2 books, so I don't have to go through both books. And they understand, but it's on your card, so it's great.
It's easy. Your address is there. You can even make sure that they're in the right place.
That's true too.
Because then if you look at that and go, hey, you actually need to be over across the street or something.
Right.
I used to vote in Lorton at TU, and they had 2 precincts there, which was really cool, but you had to be very careful that you went up to the right one and got in the right line. Otherwise, they'd send you to the other line.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, ma'am.
If you move, you need to have that changed in your voter registration card.
Yes.
And that's easy to forget to do.
And they are cracking down on that. There's a lot of people that vote where they work, which whatever. But see, it's not fair for you to vote on city things if you don't, in other words, Tulsa things, if you live in Broken Arrow or you live in.
That's true.
So they are trying to do better at, you need to vote where you live.
Yes, I live in Sapulpa. I work a lot in Tulsa County, but I need to register in Sapulpa because that's where I live. Even though I have a work address in Tulsa County, which I use for my library card. Because they're also cracking down on those now.
Let's give Molly a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks you all so much. And if you have more questions, if you have the packet, you have my card, but make sure and get a card. We would love to stay in touch, but also if you have questions or questions for November, please let me know. And if I don't know the answer, I will find the answer for you or get you connected to the right person, for sure.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wasn't it great?
Please come get more food if you want any.
My parents' problem was when I was born, they didn't have a name for me yet.